Hello everyone, welcome back to a brand new video of the Global Report. As always, we're just going to get straight into it. First off, with news out of Bakhmut. Russian forces have taken about 90% of the city now, with only roughly 10% of the city remaining. You can see right here. This area is the last line of defense for Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. And in more news regarding Bakhmut, the head of the Wagner Wagner private military company, Yevgeny Prigozhin, he said in a dramatic announcement on Friday that his forces will pull out of the city that have been trying to capture Bakhmut last summer. Prigozhin said they would withdraw on the 10th of May, ending their involvement in the longest and bloodiest battle of the war because of heavy losses and inadequate ammunition supplies. He asked defense chiefs to insert regular army troops in their place. I declare on behalf of the Wagner fighters, on behalf of the Wagner command, that on the 10th of May 2023 we are obliged to transfer positions in the settlement of Bakhmut to units of the defense ministry and withdraw the remaining of Wagner to logistic camps to lick our wounds, Prigozhin said in a statement. So this is pretty surprising news, considering Wagner has been paramount in the battle for Bakhmut, and it comes as a bit of a surprise. But Prigozhin has said in previous statements that the Russian army and that the Russian military is denying his soldiers ammunition, that they're denying supplies. I think mainly artillery ammunition, I think, was the main problem in the past. So Wagner and forces within the Russian military and within the Russian command don't get along with one another. But this also does make sense, as they've been the main forces behind the Bakhmut offensive. So them withdrawing after the battle is over makes a lot of sense, and they predict that by May 10th the battle will be over, which is a day after Victory Day in Russia, the national holiday where they celebrate their victory over Germany in World War II. So they want to get out of the battle and around that time, around that national holiday. But we are going to move on to other news from Ukraine, where Russia has been evacuating civilians from the north of Zaporizhia Oblast, the part of the province that they control, this area right here, including even in Endahar and this area here. So they were evacuating civilians, and it seems to confirm that this will be a part of Ukraine's spring offensive, which we are going to get to their announcement of that soon. But Ukraine has announced numerous times that they are going to be conducting an offensive sometime in the spring, sometime very soon, that they're going to be conducting an offensive, and it's pretty obvious that it's going to be in Zaporozhye. There might be something in Luhansk, but I think it's mainly going to be a southern offensive. I believe that there is a pretty big possibility of some kind of amphibious assaults across the river. There will definitely be assaults from the Ukrainian part of Zaporozhye to try and retake this area that's been occupied by the Russians for a long time now. These were the most successful front in the initial parts of the war was the southern front here. So I believe their goal would be obviously to try and cut off this part of the western part of the Russian occupation of Ukraine from the eastern part by trying to take maybe Bryansk or trying to get to the Azov Sea. Something like that is probably their main goal, though it would take quite a bit of time to do that and quite a bit of resources. But I think that that's ultimately what they are going to try to do. But I think the fact that Russia is evacuating civilians from the north indicates that Russia thinks that this will be the main axis of attack. So we are going to move on to the news. Ukraine says that it's wrapping up preparations for its counteroffensive, although it technically should just be called an offensive because a counteroffensive is... I think something is only considered a counteroffensive if it takes place shortly after a offensive. I think this would technically be considered offensive, but regardless, Ukraine is wrapping up preparations for a counteroffensive against Russian forces, and it is largely ready for it to go ahead, Defense Minister Ulsky Reznikov said on Friday. As soon as there is God's will, the weather, and a decision by commanders, told in an online news. He gave no date from the counteroffensive would start, but said, globally speaking, we are a high percentage ready. So we should be seeing some kind of offensive action, some kind of major offensive action from Ukraine in the coming weeks or so, or maybe even the coming days. But now we are going to move on to news from Moscow, where there was an attack on the Kremlin by a drone, a nighttime drone attack, where Russia has accused both Ukraine and the United States to be the perpetrators of the attack. And Russia has said that the attack was to try and kill President Vladimir Putin. However, Putin does rarely visit the Kremlin. So it's very interesting. This attack might have been conducted by the Ukraine and the United States collaborating with each other. It could have been conducted by domestic Russians who want to see the current government removed. It could have been really anybody. There is not a whole lot of evidence to say did it, but the attack didn't cause much damage, and this does come a few days before the Victory Day parade. As I'm sure many of you know, Russia holds annually a military parade in Red Square every Victory Day, so this comes just days before that, so I think that definitely has something to do with it. There's not a whole lot of information. We don't know who is responsible for it. Of course, both sides are blaming each other. There are some people who are saying that this is a false flag attack, that this was the Russian government doing this for whatever reason. It's just impossible to tell. So we are going to on some news out of a Stockholm think tank that says that global military spending is at an all-time high. Global military spending rose to a record last year as Russia's war in Ukraine drove the biggest annual increase in expenditure in Europe since the end of the Cold War 3 decades ago, a leading conflict and armaments think tank said on Monday. World military expenditure rose by 3.7% in real terms in 2.24 trillion, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute said in a statement. This goes back to what I've been saying for a while now, that the world is becoming more armed, becoming more militaristic. Maybe militaristic isn't the right word, but definitely there is a lot more conflicts than there were, let's say, 10 years ago. There's more conflict, there's more I guess you could say, factions in the world. Different countries are forming new alliances, and alliances are shifting. Geopolitical spheres of influence are changing, and military spending is increasing. So that is part of the reason why I decided to make these videos, is to get a better grasp and to help other people get a better grasp of what's going on around the world. Moving on to news from the United Kingdom. King Charles and Queen Camilla crowned in a historic ceremony. So the official coronation of the King and Queen of the United Kingdom took place today. So this is a very historic ceremony that has traditions that trace back to the Old Testament. And I caught a glimpse of it today, caught a little bit of it, not the whole thing, but it was a spectacular ceremony. It's a very historical ceremony, so I thought I would include it here today. I hope that the new king and queen can do good in their reign over their subjects, and that they will have a prosperous and popular reign. But we are going to move on over to the Middle East, where we have news out of Iran and Saudi Arabia. We're going to first start off with the news from Iran, where the Iranian president is set to visit Syria next week, although this was from the 28th of April, so he has, I believe, already visited Syria. This comes as Syrian diplomats and Saudi diplomats also exchanged ties, I believe 2 or 3 weeks ago now, so the point of me reporting on this is that the government in Syria has long been shunned by many of its Middle Eastern neighbors, but now the Assad government in Syria appears to be reconciling with many countries from the Middle East. So as the war in Syria slows down, there's not really a lot of fighting anymore, and the Kurdish and Damascus governments are both in close cooperation with each other, from my understanding. And the only country Syria has a whole lot of trouble with nowadays appears to be Turkey and Israel. Although I'm not sure if their relations with Lebanon are very good still, but they were even trying to reconcile with Turkey about a month or two ago, and now they are reconciling with Iran and Saudi Arabia, although Iran has supported the Damascus government. So, all of the many Middle Eastern countries are sort of welcoming Assad back into the Middle Eastern community, I suppose you could say. And that is a good thing for peace, but Assad is, many people would say he's not a good person, he's a bad leader, but I try to be neutral and objective on this and not give my opinions, my personal opinions too much. I will give my analysis, but I'll try to keep my personal opinions out of things. But in more news regarding the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia are to have reopened their embassies. They reopened their embassies within days. This was posted on the 28th of April, so they have reopened their embassies, which is good news for peace in the Middle East. Of course, a deal brokered by China a few weeks ago, about a month ago now actually, Iran and Saudi Arabia are now, they have reestablished diplomatic ties, they've reestablished their embassies, so China appears to be gaining more influence in the Middle East, and we see that Assad is also trying to regain relations in the Middle East. So it appears that the Middle East seems to be cooling off. It seems to be a more peaceful place. There is also talks of peace deals in Yemen. I believe there was a Houthi delegation and a Saudi delegation met in Yemen. So it appears that the Middle East is becoming less of a violent place, which is of course just an objectively good thing. There is still conflict in Sudan, however. this new civil war appears to still be raging on. Not much of the front line has changed. It's very hard to get a grasp of the front line. In Sudan, the situation is fluid, but this is still the rough outline of what things look like. The rapid support forces against the Sudanese government. I believe also Biden is preparing new sanctions against, I'm not sure, I believe it against the rapid support forces. They were preparing sanctions. I could be wrong though. It could be against both or just the Sudanese government. But anyways, we are going to move on to India, where India, I believe, is now the most populous country on earth according to the United Nations. By the end of April, India's population is expected to reach 1.425 billion, which is surpassing mainland China's population. So India now is according to the United Nations, is the world's most populous country, which is telling because China's birth rates are declining. And China will face a demographic crisis in the future if they don't manage to get their birth rates up. But India's birth rates appear to be still going strong, and they still are having lots of children, which is good for their future. And China, there are many articles and videos on YouTube and by experts talking about how China is facing a demographic crisis. But I obviously can't go into it here for the sake of brevity, but should definitely consider looking into that. It's very interesting and important to know. But next we're going to move on to South Korea, where the United States urges South Korea to not fill China's shortfalls if Beijing bans Micron chips. The United States asks South Korea to urge its chip makers not to fill any market gaps in China if Beijing bans memory chip makers Micron from selling chips, the Financial Times reported on Sunday. The U.S. made at the request of South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol prepares to travel to Washington on Monday. This was on April 24th. The newspaper reported, according to 4 people familiar with the talks. So, battles over the microchip processing is still going on. The economic Cold War between China and the United States over various strategic minerals and products is still happening. It's still going strong. But that is going to be it for today's episode. I believe that is everything. So, oh yes, actually, a senior cleric in Iran was shot dead, as Iran is still not a stable country from the mass protests. So now I believe we have covered everything. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.